Hello and welcome back from what I hope was a useful lunch break. Plenty of food for thought to continue chewing over, plenty of new contacts to continue making. Our next session now is on feeding the world. We are witnessing exponential growth in the population with estimates of, by 2050, us having 9 billion mouths to feed. So what are the challenges and opportunities in that? How do we generate new protein sources? How do we help farmers to plough fields more effectively and efficiently? What I should say is, after this discussion, there will be plenty of opportunity for you to go to the Innovate UK stand at that point to continue the discussion and debate, to talk amongst your peers around the things you've heard in this session. And at 2:30 after this session, we'll have Sir Mark Walport talking about blue sky thinking on the session there. So quite a lot going on. To lead this discussion on feeding the world, I'm pleased to welcome our Director for Health and Life Sciences, Ian Campbell. Ian is a very experienced executive in the life sciences area and in diagnostics. Before joining Innovate UK in October 2016, he was Chief Executive of Arca Diagnostics, a company looking at developing and commercialising immunoassay tests for cancers of the prostate and the bladder. And I can't believe I'm talking about this so soon after lunch, but please welcome to the stage, Ian.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you had a very good lunch. Today we're going to discuss feeding the world, and I think it's probably good to reflect after having lunch this topic rather than beforehand, so we're fortunate there. But I wanted to set the scene for the session by talking about the fact that 1 in 3 children born in the UK are expected to live to the age of 100 years. So that gives us an increase in population. We will need to increase food production by 60% by 2050 in order to feed the population demand at that time. So that would be 10 billion people. It's quite a thought that we have to do that. If we keep consuming food and wasting food and using the land as we do today, by the time we get to that, we will need 4 planets in order to feed us. So we have to find real innovative and technical solutions to do that. And I want to ask a question before we begin the session. Of the 7 billion people in the world today, 2 billion of them routinely eat insects. How many of you would swap your lunch for an insect sandwich today? So we've got a bit of persuading to do over the next hour or so. So I'm going to introduce the panelists up one by one. So first of all, can we have Mark Swainson up on the stage? Mark is the Deputy Head and Lead for Higher Education and Research at Lincoln University's National Centre for Food Manufacturing.
Pleasure to be here speaking to you all today. As Ian said, I'm lead for the research and the higher education that goes on at the University of Lincoln's National Centre for Food Manufacturing. And before I joined the university 10 years ago now, I spent nearly 20 years in high-risk chilled foods manufacturing, operations and technical management. So working with all the major retail groups and all the major food service groups, and it gave me a very good insight in terms of the whole food supply chain and its challenges. And whilst you don't think of it at the time, it does prepare you well for conversations like today with regards to the industry challenges we face. Underpinning all the science and innovation that we'll particularly concentrate on today is also the skills and education agenda as well. A lot of what we do at the Food Centre is about developing not only the innovation but also those skills with the food industry. So everybody we work with is already in the food manufacturing sector or related supply chain and technology providers. So here, where we're talking particularly and strongly focused on future innovations, it's worth bearing in mind that 66% of the workforce in 2030 is already working in their respective sectors now. So yes, we have a whole schools agenda to work at, but we also have an agenda to work out with regards to our current employees in the food supply chain. As I mentioned earlier, we're part of the University of Lincoln, which as we're the National Centre for Food Manufacturing, we also bring with us schools of engineering, schools of computer science, schools of life sciences, maths, physics, pharmacy, and that gives us a nice melting pot in terms of the innovations we can bring to bear in the sector. Our research is all about the 3 I's: industry, innovation, and impact. And we work across a whole range of different subject areas, often with the support of Innovate UK and our industrial R&D partners, looking at just some examples. OAL working with high-speed steam infusion systems and technologies. BOC Lindy Group looking at rapid cryogenic cooling systems to look at rapidly advancing volume outputs in the sector. So when we talk about feeding 10 billion people, actually one place we can start is actually in the industrial sector itself and its outputs and its capacity. We're seeing robotics and automation growing rapidly day by day, and we're working on a number of different initiatives to be able to put robotics and automation into the center of the manufacturing system as well, which also will help on the 10 billion agenda. And then obviously the food microbiology, food chemistry and nutrition angle in terms of making our foods more nutritious and ensuring the quality and safety of the supply chain is also vitally important. So pleasure to be here today. Hope I can contribute well to the debate, and look forward to meeting some of you afterwards as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I think we'll just bring the remainder of the panelists up just now so that we can get them all on stage. So first of all, we can have Arnoud, please, who is the Chief Technology Officer for Saturn Bioponics, based here in Birmingham. At late notice, I'm also pleased that my colleague Catherine Miller has been able to accept an invitation onto the stage to replace Kate, who unfortunately can't make it. Catherine is our innovation lead for food and has previous experience with Celiac UK. Welcome, Catherine. On a completely different tack, we also thought it's important to look at the economy and investment. So I'm pleased that Dr. Rob Wiley can also join us from, he's the chairman of Agritech Investments and has a wide experience of investments throughout this space. And last but not least, we have Willem Soderland here, who represents Seymour, and his ambition is to turn seaweed into a product that we eat every day. I think it'd be useful, Arno, if you could give us some background into Saturn, please.
Welcome. I'm happy everybody is here and choose this discussion over their lunch. My name is Arnoud Witteveen. I'm CTO of Saturn Bioponics. So with Saturn Bioponics, we have a three-dimensional hydroponic system. That system is all about sustainable intensification of crop production. As a company, we use this system as a platform to deliver our hydroponic science. However, that hydroponic science is not just limited to the system, but actually can be used in any scenario when it comes to crop production in particular. And it's all, in my opinion, it's all about improving the existing agricultural situation and looking at a sustainable way of doing that. My background is in plant science and plant biotechnology. So we really come from a plant perspective when it's about our hydroponic science. And at Wageningen University, where I was for quite a time, the topic feeding the world, or the challenge about feeding the world, was a very common topic to be involved in. And I've learned that it's not just about, let's say, the farmer or the way we're producing crops. It's about distribution. It's about food waste and obviously also people's diets. One topic we also covered at Wageningen University is 50% more with 50% less. And that is really about the sustainable intensification again. And I think it's, when we look at being more sustainable, being better with our resources, it's all about the appropriate technology and a commercial viable setup. So we really trying to push that we have a technology that is available at this point and not for the future, because feeding the world is a challenge we are facing today. And I will get in more detail later, so I'll give the word to Kate.
So it's extremely short notice for Catherine, but I think it would be good if she would share her experiences on particular subsets of the population with food intolerances and what we've got to be tending to them as well. So maybe you should give us some background, Catherine.
Okay, thanks. So yes, I'm Catherine Miller and I'm Innovation Lead for Food. I've been at Innovate 3 months, so prior to that I had a background with patients with celiac disease, so quite a high proportion of the population who need to avoid gluten. So I'm interested in terms of feeding the world, in terms of providing enough food, but also the potential for, with growing populations, growing prevalence of things like allergies and intolerances, and actually there's an opportunity maybe to address some of those issues as well with changing diets. And also with diet-related diseases in terms of obesity, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes that are becoming increasingly prevalent. Actually feeding the world in a healthier way is important as well.
Thank you, Catherine. Rob, obviously investments in this space is double-edged because obviously we're facing food shortages, but also we're looking at growing economy and building new companies. Maybe you could talk from an investment perspective as to what you look for in companies, how you assess them, and what you think the key drivers will be in making the food chain more sustainable going forward.
Well, okay, so a little bit of background on what I chair, as it were, so put it into context. I love setting things up. So I set up an organisation called Web in the early 2000s, built it, and that covered private equity, listed equity and infrastructure, all to do with impact investment. I chair that, but I'm now focused really on the food ag sector, which was my original background. I spent 10 years in Shell's ag chem business. So in terms of what we're looking for, the vehicles by which I can look for it are as follows. So over the last 12 to 18 months, I set up an organisation called Cambridge Agritech, syndicate of private investors, and these investors are owners or directors of some of the largest agricultural businesses in the UK. Why? Because there's a dearth of knowledgeable investors in early stage agri-food tech businesses, and also many of the innovations are blocked by the large companies because they just take too long. They're on a different planet when it comes to their own time frame. So I thought that was quite an interesting vehicle. And what they are looking for, and these are individuals, are things which are relevant to their businesses, which improves their profitability. But I always like to challenge them. So we meet every 3 or 4 times a year, and I bring along what I call a curved ball, which is something that has no relevance to their business whatsoever. And it's quite interesting, out of the 4 investments they've made, 2 of them being curved balls. So one's about gene editing of bananas. You may be aware that most of the bananas in the world are actually one variety, and are about to be decimated by one single fungal pathogen, and very clever chaps at Norwich Biocentre are involved in that. And the other one, none of them are involved in animal husbandry, but you've obviously heard a lot about badger culls and so forth due to tuberculosis. And a group out of the UK, they've developed a very rapid testing for tuberculosis in cattle. Literally hours as opposed to days or weeks, and hence you don't get cross-infection of herds. Can save a huge amount of money, and that can then be backwards slanted into humans. So what are they looking for? I mean, this is really what they're looking for, because they're the investors. They're looking for things where great team who've been there and done it before, so they're not looking out for fresh things from, sort of Judge Business School or anything like that. They are not scared about going very early stage, but they want to see things where they think they can make money. And in particular, from their perspective, remember these are long-standing farming enterprise. They feel a responsibility about passing on their assets in an improved state to future generations. So there is that sustainability angle for them. The second thing I've been involved in setting up is I chair a new agri-food tech fund. So it look to invest right across the food chain, from inputs, manufacturing, and the products at the end, which is what you're more involved in. Their typical size of investment will be around about the 3 to 5 million mark. They're looking at things at a later stage, where they feel that, frankly, there's very little investment vehicles in Europe compared to the US, and therefore the pricing in Europe should be much better, supply and demand, simple economics. And so their idea is to have a knowledgeable group, and they've got a very knowledgeable group around them who know and understand this sector very well. They will invest their money in European companies, including the UK, and almost certainly co-invest with Americans to take it over to America and sell it over there. So they're looking for financial returns, but with a very, very strong impact focus. So they will measure the impact of their investments for each and every investment and report in a transparent fashion every year. The final area, and then I'll stop, because you didn't, I was a bit more than an introduction, you asked me the question. The final area is a very intriguing concept, which is a spin out from the World Wildlife Fund, the WWF, which I thought was all to do with pandas and tigers and stuff like that, which is very, very good causes, but there's a huge amount of expertise in commodity pricing, commodities in general, blockchain analysis for food security, which is another application. But they have no way of exploiting that in a commercial manner. So they've been incubating for the last 18 months a corporate-led accelerator. And I'll give you an example of what that means. To actually accelerate the uptake of innovation at scale. So they're looking for shifting 10% of certain product lines which have the biggest impact on climate change within the next 10 years. So the first one they're doing is on animal feed, substituting soya in animal feed and fish protein with other sources of protein. And they've signed up a company called Nutreco, who's paying for it all. And Nutreco's also signed for agreed a procurement agreement at very large scale for the technologies eventually vetted to come through. And we're going to repeat that 10 times across the planet. So that's a slightly different angle. But again, host of technologies. Yours could be one, you know, because alternative source of protein, you've just got to be able to make 150 million tons of it. So those are the sort of things. But what they're looking for is fundamentally, at the bottom line is, how can we produce more with less input? It's about efficiency in the long term.
So that's a very good point. And I think sustainability is going to be crucial. We have finite resources in terms of land, water. The temperatures are changing, and therefore we need to look for alternatives of food. Well, then maybe you could give us some detail behind what Seymour are aiming to achieve and the progress so far.
Definitely. A few years ago, I found a species of seaweed that looks exactly like pasta, like tagliatelle. And my first thought was, why are we not eating this as pasta? We were trying to cut down in carbs in my family. So I thought, let's give it a try. So I found the seaweed, had no recipes. I made a bolognese sauce. I tossed it on top. I gave it to my kids. There's no better way than experimenting than on your children. And after finishing their plates, they survived, they looked happy, so the first experiment was successful. I dug a little bit deeper on what seaweed was all about. I found that it's actually the original superfood. It's probably the healthiest vegetable that we have, and it fits with all the modern healthy diets, and it combats all the modern diseases that we have. And then I dug even deeper on more the sustainability side, and I found exactly what you said, that we're going to be needing 4 planets. And I think Elon Musk is not going to be fast enough to bring Mars and other planets closer by. So we need to do something else. And the interesting thing is that we're now getting 2% of our food from the ocean, and it represents 71% of the planet. So that's a pretty obvious one. And the second fact, which was startling, is that 50% of all the CO2 is absorbed by seaweed. So I basically found that seaweed was very tasty, incredibly healthy, and the most sustainable food on the planet. So I thought, let's start a company that will turn seaweed into an everyday food. We've introduced 3 products. Icy pasta, icy bacon, which you see here, which is 100% seaweed that turns into bacon when you fry it. And then icy wraps, which is a tortilla wrap that we're introducing. Interestingly enough, we're a small company, but in two years' time, we've gotten our products onto 750 stores in 6 countries, and we brought about 750,000 servings of seaweed to people. And we're basically showing that it is possible to find something so close to us in nature that can really have an impact. And we are looking now, we have a proof of concept. Now we want to scale up and create even more impact. I think the 3 things that we see that are necessary for us to make that step are investors. We need capital for things like this. We're looking to collaborate with retailers that can help create scale, with food services companies. But also, I think what we need is a friendly regulatory environment, because sometimes institutions that, for instance, tell us what nutrition is good for us can be 40, 50 years behind in thinking. And that's not always useful when you're introducing new foods. So that's a little bit my perspective on where we come from.
Very good. I'm interested more about the collaborative side, because technology and innovations get us so far, but it is a collaborative process. From the academic side, Mark, where do you think collaboration can take us in terms of aligning everybody to address some of these challenges?
Personally, I think you always start with the problem first, and then cluster the right skill sets, expertise, and knowledge to actually solve those problems. That's where Innovate UK initiatives are so strong, because they are about consortia a lot of the time. They are about building the right sort of set of team members to resolve the issue or to solve the problem or advance the science. I think it has to be win-win. I know it sounds obvious, but it's vitally important. You've got to have everybody in the room, advancing and winning together. And it has to be focused. You have to have the milestones, you have to have the clear plan. These challenges are immediate. They're not going away, they're only getting harder. And so actually having some urgency as well, we find, is very important.
Arnoud, maybe you could share with us some of your experience of moving from an academic career into Saturn here in Birmingham, the decision to make that transition and what you've been able to bring to Saturn since you've joined.
Yes, absolutely. So, as I said, the problem or the challenge of food production is not. I think it's not so much about the future, because we often get distracted on technology that is sort of niche, and we have very imaginary ideas about the future, but actually we should start this problem right now with the appropriate technology that is available and could be adapted once further advanced technology becomes available. I think it's not about moving away from agriculture as it is, but it is about revolutionizing it. For instance, I think people build their models or the prediction well, that's my opinion, in a wrong way, because they think that, for instance, we use about 38% of the land surface of the planet Earth for agriculture, and they say, well, if we want to double, so if our demands double, and if we want to double that production, we probably need to be cutting down rainforest. And personally, I'm very against deforestation, but I think it's not about that. It's about filling the yield gaps that are currently in our food production. And there we can, personally, I think, very easily make the difference. We can easily double or even triple our food production in our current situation. And it's all about finding those yield gaps. And, simple practices could be a solution for this. And another problem where people often look is finding the research in the current agriculture. So fresh water is one of the main reasons where people start to become anxious. And yes, about 70% of fresh water is being used for agriculture, because it was a very easy way of intensifying your crop production by just giving the plant a lot of water. But so one crop of lettuce, for instance, takes about 65 liters of water to grow. That's just as much as my shower this morning. But we are saying with our crop production system, we can reduce that amount of water by less than 2 liters. So basically, we're saying we shouldn't be using 70% of fresh water for our crop production or our agriculture, but we should be using less than 5%. And then all of a sudden we get a lot of fresh water available. I think it's all about the practicality of applying the right technology and finding those solutions. And we should be thinking in loops. We should be combining appropriate technology in a commercially viable way. And so this is something where different ways of producing food can interact and reducing food waste. And that is really what our sector, or what we as a company trying to achieve.
Well, then, from your point of view, there's plenty of seawater around, there's plenty of seaweed. How do we determine how edible it is, and what would prevent us from scaling that up to address the deficiency in terms of our food supply chain?
I think there's no proof needed that it's edible. I mean, if you look at Asia, they've been eating seaweed for centuries, and not for health or sustainability reasons, but for taste reasons. We're just slow in catching up. And if I would be allowed to let people try, they wouldn't go back to normal bacon after trying this. I think the interesting thing is that you were asking about scale. What they've now calculated is that if you were to take an area the size of twice of Portugal and use that to cultivate or to grow seaweed, you would have enough protein for the entire world population. And twice the size of Portugal sounds big, but it's nothing on the total area of the ocean. So that's just a little bit of a perspective. I couldn't agree more. We're thinking about doubling land space. No, it's about radical solutions that are much closer than we think. And it requires imagination, which is not, it's not hard to find. What it does also require is, I think, scale. If you want to have any of these new innovations, technologies work, you need scale. There's a chicken and egg problem that needs to be solved in the beginning, and we see that now all the time. And I think that's also where the financial world, the funding, comes into play, because it's very difficult to grow organically to a certain scale that works. So that's where the investment sector needs to step in, and I think it is starting to happen. We were just talking about it, that there's a very fast-growing interest in Europe now in investing in food, not just ag tech, but in food in general. I think we're a little bit behind on the US in that sense.
Quite a bit behind,
but it is starting. Yeah.
Maybe you want to elaborate on the gap between ourselves and the rest of the world in terms of picking that up, Rob?
In America, they've got very excited about it. And there's a huge amount of money going into this area in the US, driven by Silicon Valley. I always have the sort of adage that if Silicon Valley chaps are piling into something, that's the time to not do it. That's why I'm not rich. Perhaps. But no, they've piled a lot. But you've got to remember the American model is different. It's a big land mass, it's underused, and it's not efficiently used. It's a totally different game. However, there's a huge amount of money going into that. Over here, in this side of the country, in Europe, there are actually very few, but they're starting. Yeah. There are very few, but they're starting, and there is interest. And I think actually there's a huge amount of interest in Asia and in Africa as well. Everyone talks about Europe and US, but there's a lot of interest, particularly from China, in looking at the One Belt, One Road syndrome, and in Africa. And there's some quite simple things that can be done to actually improve the efficiency in these developing countries. And I've come across a marvelous guy who, do you mind if I just tell a little story? It's actually nothing to do with him. He's a marvelous guy, he's Indian, who won a business plan competition sponsored by Reuters. And it was about improving the profitability of farmers in India. And what he actually developed was a business where, with a simple mobile app, he could bypass the middlemen in terms of determining the price of crops that these basically rural small farmers could actually achieve. And they could see on their phone straight away what the price should be and what the weather's going to be, and and what inputs they could have. And there's a chat service, there's a network where farmers could swap stories to each other and all this sort of stuff. Through this very simple process, they've got now, I think, just over 4 million farmers signed up. This took about 6 or 7 years. And what it's enabled them to do is improve their profitability by at least 25%, purely through this route. Very simple. And what that also means is they enable the farmers to borrow money better and cheaper from the very many banks or microfinance routines that you have set up in India. So that provides a sustainability for the manufacturing process that you're having in those countries. Africa, a similar system has occurred, and this is rather more of a networking thing, again on the mobile phone. So these are very simple applications, which is basically farmers swapping stories and hints. What do you know about this? What do you know about that? Oh, if you do this, you can get it from there. As opposed to Western development world imposing their own solutions on these people, which is unsustainable. Because you have to go back, the killer gene that Monsanto produces. I mean, anyway, that's another story altogether.
So Mark, that's one non-technical innovation that has enabled communication to improve productivity. What about solutions that you see in your line of work? Is there any technical innovations that you see coming to the fore that would be of interest?
Absolutely. There's a number of there's a lot of people throwing around the term Industry 4.0, and I think over the coming months, with the government announcing, the industrial strategy that it wants to take forward, we're going to see more detail in terms of what that means to the sector in terms of the digitalization agenda. There's a lot of information already out there that we can use better, that will shine a light on being able to work more effectively, more productively, more efficiently. Essentially, it comes down to the key points we've already been talking about. How do we produce more with less? How do we make things more efficiently and effectively? How do we waste less? And how do we distribute better? And also, no one size fits all. So the India model is a very interesting one, that what works in a society in India where half of your population are smallholder farmers is very different to what works in a completely different agri-food system in the Western world. So the application of technology is vitally important, but used correctly in the right areas of the world. We know that robotics and automation is an absolute given in our area. We know that the industry is facing a perfect storm of increasing costs of labour, and that's when we've actually got enough labour to actually run the factories. So robotics and automation is going to be coming through to the fore very strongly, and we're already seeing it in the work that we're doing with the food manufacturers and the technology providers to those food manufacturers. Advanced food processing technologies as well. I think one of the panel already made the point. We already know we can make far more. We know we can make far more and far more effectively. But actually using the right technologies that can do that while still being energy efficient and being user-friendly and actually giving us all the wins we want is the trick. The technology's out there, but applying it correctly is a key. And there's a lot of work to be done on the food chemistry, the food nutrition, the food health agenda. But there's a whole piece around public policy as well, because the 5-a-day policy from the government in terms of 5 portions of fruit and veg every day being the target for ourselves to eat as consumers. I think the latest statistics are that 80% of the population gets the message, but only about 30% is actually doing that right now. So at each point in that supply chain and each point in the agenda, we've got to have a nice connected approach to how we not only feed the nation and feed the globe effectively, but also nutritiously, healthily, and energy efficiently as well.
Catherine, do you have any views on how the agri-tech centres may be able to help with innovation and development and scaling companies in the UK?
I think the agri-tech centres, the 4 agri-tech centres, obviously aim to be global leaders in particular areas in terms of crop health. So we mentioned various times it's not just about increasing more. We can potentially look more at waste and look at more targeted precision engineering and better crop health protection. Also, I guess looking at data. I think data is a big thing, that actually making small changes that can have quite a big effect on the amount of waste that we're producing. I think the agri-tech centres are a key area that industry can get more involved in. And then also in terms of the food waste, I think in terms of the consumer getting smarter packaging to try and sort of minimise that waste in the home as well. There's an aspect of innovation that could be useful there as well.
Arnoud, what would stop your technology being put into every single home in the UK and being used routinely to help us produce food?
Sorry.
What is preventing us from adopting your technology in every single home in the UK to produce more food?
Well, the farming industry is quite fixed. That they're quite doing what they want, but it's not just the farmer being conservative. It's also the supply and demand chain, the retailers, and what we want as a consumer. And it is very hard to, I believe, to break those cycles and to introduce your technology at that point. I definitely think that that you need to be introducing technology from a different angle, where the farmer is utilizing the technology, but not being completely responsible for it. And it's also about educating the people and how do we perceive our food, how do we want our food. And a very, very simple example of food waste is we can produce a lot of pak choi in our system. So we could produce up to 3-4 times more pak choi in a square meter, and that sounds lovely. But if the farmer then harvests the pak choi and chops off 30% of that, which is then basically food waste, what's the point of producing more pak choi per square meter? And why do they chop off this 30%? Because people like to have a very nice looking pak choi in the supermarket, not with leaves flapping around everywhere. They want a chopped off base, and that goes into a twin pack. And another example is, for instance, we can bulk up the pak choi, so we can give it a better yield, a bigger product, and then the farmer chops off 50% of that pak choi because it needs to go in a twin pack, which is combined 250 grams. So there is this. I think that it's also a mindset of how do consumers and retailers approach innovative ideas in food production.
Rob?
I think we're entering, going back to the point, how do we get the market to adopt? I think we're actually entering into a really quite interesting, and I personally think exciting time, because there is a big realization by the retailers and by the big food manufacturers, and I'm talking about the Mars and Unilevers, that they can't carry on the way they have done. And so they are making some changes. And I think actually it creates a very exciting time. And most of the food majors have now got their own venture capital funds, which they never had done before. But I think if I'm old enough to remember eating out in London was not a very pleasant experience in the 60s. There's very little choice. Coffee was dreadful. But look at us now. I mean, we just take for granted that we can eat whatever we want, whenever we want. So our tastes have changed. I mean, who would have thought of eating Japanese food? We would never have thought of eating Japanese food. Now, I love Japanese food. I mean, so people can change their taste if you present it in the right way. So I see no problem in you being able to sell I love to taste your bacon, because I'm not allowed pork, you see, for health reasons. And so very much into that sort of thing. But I think there's a lot of opportunity to do this if it's marketed right. And going back to your problem about packaging, they will change once they know this is possible. Present them with the solutions, and they will make the changes.
Mark?
I think just amplifying the message that's coming through there as well, this connecting the supply chain together to work together rather than as in individual points of interest is going to be vitally important, because we've talked about the specification on the produce. What does the consumer want? The retailers will tell the food supply chain, actually, we're only looking for what the consumer wants. But there's a piece around the consumer in terms of exactly sort of what is the best model, what is the best fit in terms of their consumption, how are they best purchasing and then storing this produce, because then the whole waste agenda comes in as well. If we're selling too much because we're putting 2-for-1s in packs, etc., that can be a problem. But as Catherine said as well, if we're advancing the packaging technology, actually if we make the product last longer on the supermarket shelves and in the consumer's home, we can waste far less that way as well. So looking for those optimizing win-wins across the food supply chain is vitally important, and a personal opinion, we don't do enough of it. The commercial interest at each point in the chain often blocks that working as a whole partnership across the whole food supply chain.
I want to take us forward now to 2050. Hopefully we'll still be here. What is your vision for our diet in 2050, Willem? What are we going to be eating if we're getting to this world of not having enough food?
What should I say? Huh?
Seaweed.
I will possibly start with seaweed.
I will take the cue. Definitely. I think there's going to be a much wider variety of foods, and I think definitely that seaweed with over 10,000 species, people don't even realize that you know, I don't know how many types of vegetables there are, but I'm pretty sure that there's more types of seaweed than there's types of land vegetables. So I'm convinced that it's going to be one of the big sources of food. But in general, I think we will see a much greater variety of foods, and I think it is a really exciting time. I think the big challenge will be on the adoption side and the retail side, and I'm fascinated also by not just what will be in our diet, but how do we get the food? How does it come to us? Where do we buy it? Because we see a lot of developments in online retail with Amazon buying Whole Foods, and what is going to happen? What are the benefits for consumers that are going to come out of it? What I'm hoping is that maybe it's not so much personalized nutrition, but it's at least it's something where it's going to become much easier for consumers to find those foods that will make them feel better, that will make them happier. And that means that it's going to be very personal, the diet.
Arnoud, would you like to comment?
Yeah, so I think we definitely need to be going towards efficiency, and I definitely agree that as a protein-based, the protein of our diet should definitely, be moving away from a very efficient model as we were running it at this point. As crops, regarding to crops, I definitely think we ought to be moving back towards flavorful products, products with a lot of nutritional value. It's basically, as a very simple example, a tomato in the UK or in the Netherlands, for that matter, just basically tastes like water. And that is because it is grown in a very effective hydroponic way, but not focused on flavor at all. And when you go to the southern Europe, you can taste it, what an actual tomato should taste like. And so I think a lot of people will move back towards taste and flavor in their food, and actually the nutritional value. I don't believe we will become completely functional when it comes to our diet. I always think there will be some form of emotion involved, and that will be growing more and more in developing countries as well. As you see, for instance, in China, that the whole consumption of food is shifting towards what we have in the Western world, and so we ought to be, facing that challenge as well, not just the quantity, but also how are we, which direction are we going to take, and how do we present, a good diet.
Mark, with your expertise in food manufacturing, looking towards that 2050 vision, what do you think the key developments have to be for manufacturers and suppliers, as well as growers, that ultimately mean that the consumers get food that they want to eat, that's flavoursome, nutrition and sustainable?
Yeah, I think starting with that end in mind is vitally important. So what does the consumer of 2050 want? And be very conscious that consumer is a very multifaceted individual. Both in terms of what they want out of their diet and also how much they can actually afford, because the food has to be affordable as well as nutritious. And so making sure a model that works for everybody is in place is vitally important. That given, and working then the problem back, can we make enough? Yes, we can make enough. The advanced food processing technologies, the robotics and automation, the technology is there and advancing rapidly. The Internet of Things and all that generation is going to bring with it in terms of advances in efficiency, productivity, insight into markets is already rapidly moving forward. So I think the key really is sort of how do we get there from here? What does our current food supply chain look like? And are we distributing correctly as well? There was some figures a while ago now where a third of the population is obese of the globe, and a third is malnourished. So is our problem as much about distribution as it is about productivity and being able to make enough volume in the world? And are we optimizing our food system to the extent of actually growing the right produce in the right areas of the world. And we mentioned the point about seasonality of produce earlier as well. You know, do we always have to have product, you know, out of season on our supermarket shelves? Are we better off sort of looking at seasonality? Well, it depends on where you are and depends which market you want to be working within. I think it's important that we do just take a look at our whole productivity agenda as well as the UK and have a look at why are we falling behind some of our you know, other countries across Europe and more wide across the globe, because I think there's a lot of things we can learn by looking a bit further afield as well.
Thank you. We've got some 15 minutes left. I think all of us in the room are affected by diet. We all want to eat. We all want to eat nice things. And we all want to see what the future will hold. I want to open up the floor now to questions for you to ask the members of the panel to see what you can stimulate by way of further discussion from your own thoughts and experiences. So can we have hands for questions? If you would stand up once you raise your hand and the microphone's with you, then you can ask a question.
Hi, yeah, this is more of a personal-based question with the interest in diet. And I think food and sustainability about food have been come across in the last couple of months quite a few times, more so as a professional or through uni education as opposed to as a consumer in everyday life. And I think a lot of the challenges you spoke about, that breaking that cycle from beginning of the food chain to the consumer, is really hard to break. And how do you connect it all? But how do we educate that everyday consumer to take it upon themselves? Because I think the stat that you gave, 80% of people know they should be having 5 of it every day, but only 30% of people are. So how do you drive the consumer to change their behaviour? Because ultimately, that's what's going to drive the change in the supply chain.
Willem, as you're going to drive the biggest change in consumer habits, I think you should have the first right reply.
I don't think there is one specific thing, but there's a couple of things that, of course, you need companies or brands that do their own thing, that create the right content and try to educate. I think it actually starts in schools, and that takes a little bit more time. But if I look at my kids and how their attitude towards food and the planet and everything in general, it's completely different than my parents and even my own. So I think when schools are starting to teach children about nutrition and where food comes from, that's going to have a huge impact. I think the second thing is that maybe we need to look at whether pricing of food should reflect the cost to either your health or to the planet. I'm an entrepreneur, so I usually don't like intervening in the market, but sometimes we should think about it. If products reflect the price of the product reflects that, then it will become easier for people there to change their behavior. So these are at least two things that I can see that can make a big difference.
Anybody else got any comment on that?
Yeah,
Rob?
I got. You've actually got a very big unseen problem in the UK, and also in quite wealthy parts of the UK, which is food poverty by a very large number of people. So there, and I'm talking about the homeless. Well, okay. So I live in an area of North London, not Tower Hamlets, and in my area, I know at some of the local schools, some of the children come to school without having eaten anything, and they rely on school food for their nutrition. So yes, it's got to start at schools, but also you've got to address the other problems, hence the growth of food banks and so forth. So that's an issue to deal with, first of all. The second point is that is actually an educational one from the medical fraternity. Yeah, true. Because I may be wrong, but I think the average doctor in his entire medical training career has about 5 hours of talks on nutrition.
That's amazing. Yeah.
So most doctors know really little, as much as I do, about nutrition. And I, from my own personal experience and seeing others, I do know that nutrition has a huge influence on your brain, your body, all that sort of thing. So, and also in the behavior of children. And so it's a vicious circle, but it's also a virtuous circle. Now, how the hell you do that, I don't know. I really don't. When you're faced with, on the one hand, the ones that you probably most want to educate, having no food at all and having to get support for it, and of course they go to the McDonald's and whatever. But that's the issue, and maybe it's something that you guys can hammer in on.
Yeah.
You know, banning a few things. How about that? No.
I think it's an interesting question, and I don't think there's, it's very complicated. But I think the issue with food is that, you know, it's emotional, it's social. Everybody eats several times a day. Food choices are influenced by so many different things in terms of, you know, prices of food, but also access. You know, whether you've got a car, whether you haven't got a car, whether you work shifts, whether you don't work shifts. So there's so many aspects that I think need to be considered in actually changing, potentially a huge change in behaviour from our current diet to potentially something completely different.
Mark, just on the positive side of things, yeah, we all want our food to taste great, but we also want to live forever. So there's a reason why manufacturers on the packs, when there is a health claim to be made, we're making it very strongly, because, you know, that does sell to the consumer. So there's a willing market there for healthier, more nutritious, more sort of beneficial products out there. And we just got to keep on moving those messages forward and giving the consumer more of what evidently they want.
Can we have the next question?
Michael Rouget, Airponics. It's just one issue. I feel the title today now was Feeding the World. And you did ask the question, you know, if in 2050, how will we have solved the problem? You know, we've heard we'll need 60% more food, or just by 2030, we'll need 35% more food. And it's a massive problem. You know, from Syria, I'm told that's why we had the trouble. I haven't heard, apart from the seaweed, which could be a big answer to that, all this, a bit of food saving here, a bit of efficiency, supply chain, you know, that's not going to solve it. And we talk about others, you know, it's not vertical farming or hydroponics, but they just grows herbs and lettuces, and no one can survive on that. You know, aren't we complacent? We need radical solutions. And are there any, apart from maybe the seaweed, which I've heard today, but are there any?
Rob?
A few. Okay, so radical solutions. Better use of what we've got. Oceans and land is one thing, and then that's the prime thing. I think there could well be instances where the traditional way of looking at genetic breeding and that sort of stuff may be turned on its head. Because I've come across some technologies whereby it's basically a data-driven business with sensors where you're maximizing the uptake of nutrients in the soil into plants. And they've shown on a consistent basis a 40% yield increase. 40% yield increase with less water, less use of fertilizer, and less use of pesticides. And going back to the nutrition question, I saw it in a very naive fashion saying, well, if you eat healthily, you tend to be a bit healthier. You're less prone to disease. You don't get skin disease and so forth. And plants are probably no different. So if you've got a healthy plant which maximizes its nutrient intake, which is what I'm sure you're trying to do in your hydroponics scheme. Yeah? But if you can actually do it in nature, so you've got the nature-nurture regime. There are techniques to do that. The problem is the traditional suppliers of solutions would not be in favor of this because it reduces what they can sell. And that's the revolutionary bit, which is the bit I like quite getting stuck into, is to challenge the system and the traditional players in the market, which is what basically I'm doing.
Yeah, I think I was in a climate conference in Oslo yesterday, and usually when I'm speaking somewhere, there's also somebody representing the insect sector. They always want to have seaweed and insects on stage. What I find fascinating is, I'm talking about insects now, not about seaweed, so that's fascinating by itself. But what they were showing is that if you look at how much feed you need to basically get to a kilo of, for instance, beef or pork, they showed that if you put in 10 kilos of feed, you get, I think, 1 kilo of beef, and you get 9 kilos of insects. So, that's not completely sustainable if you just look at the net result, but it's much more. And I think even if adoption of insects from a psychological perspective wouldn't go so fast, then it could still become a huge source of protein. So I think inventiveness of people will become better and better and better, and they might turn out to be very big solutions, like insects.
Do you have any more questions from the audience? So I've got one statement that I heard today that I want to share with the panel and get the reaction to. And I heard in a talk this morning that we now produce 71 billion chickens a year for global consumption. It was 58 billion just 5 years ago. What are the thoughts about how we recover from that to get to a sustainable food climate? Arnoud?
Well, I think there's something fundamentally wrong with our perception of what nice food is, what good food is, and what we experience as almost as a good emotion when it comes to food. And when let's say we need to eat seaweed protein and insect protein, but are we really going to do that in the future? Well, maybe if it tastes like chicken and it looks like chicken, maybe we will. And that is what exactly what is what is wrong. Our whole perception is something we don't step away from this mindset that food is nice, food is happy. Gives us a good experience as long as it tastes like chicken. But this is something that you can change, and that has to start from generation to generation. And we are struggling to accept that we are ever going to eat insects or ever going to change, because we've grown up in an environment where you get your little chicken with some sauce, and it's nice, it's good. And so I think we may be thinking that will not change, and there will be a struggle to actually eat different sources of protein. But next generation or two generation might laugh at us and say they were still eating chicken.
Yeah. So when we started the discussions, I said 2 billion of the 7 billion population today regularly eat insects. And we had a show of hands at the start to see how many of you would actually want to do that and choose to do that rather than have your bacon sandwich. Having heard the comments over the past hour, have we changed anybody's mind? How many people will now choose to eat insects if it was offered as part of your diet today?
There we go.
So we've made some progress over the past hour. We've not quite convinced everybody, I don't think.
Don't forget the seaweed bacon.
Exactly. You're asking the wrong question.
What's the question then?
No. I've said enough about seaweed. So. Yeah.
All that remains for me to do is to thank my panel for such an interesting debate over the hour. Thank you to the audience for listening so attentively. So to Mark, to Arno, to Catherine, to Rob, and to Willem, thank you very much. Thank you all for your attention. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.